Right before we dive in, let's make this story bigger than just me and you. Tell me in the comments, what part of the world are you watching from, and what's the clock striking there? Morning, night, or somewhere in between? I want to see how far this story can reach. Now lean closer. Here's where it all begins. The rope around Seraphine Valmont's neck was rough against her pale skin as the mob dragged her toward the hanging tree, their voices a chorus of hatred and fear that had been building for 3 years since her husband's mysterious death. "Witch!" they screamed. "Devil's bride! You've cursed our town long enough!" The widow's black dress was torn and muddy from being pulled through the streets of Redemption Falls, but her violet eyes burned with defiance rather than terror as she faced the death that everyone believed she deserved. The stranger appeared like a shadow against the setting sun, his horse thundering down the main street with deadly purpose, while his voice cut through the mob's fury like a blade through silk. "Let her go," commanded Lucien Dubois, his weathered face hard as granite and his hand resting on the Colt revolver that had made him legend throughout the territories. The crowd hesitated, recognizing the reputation that preceded him even to this remote Colorado mountain town. But their fear of the widow was stronger than their fear of any single man. "She's a killer and a curse-bringer," shouted Mayor Hartwell, his face red with righteous anger and whiskey courage. "3 men dead in 3 years, all of them who got too close to her. The town voted, and justice will be done today." The rope tightened around Seraphine's throat as 2 men prepared to throw the other end over the ancient oak's strongest branch, while women in the crowd crossed themselves and muttered prayers for protection against whatever evil the widow might unleash in her final moments. Lucien's response was swift and decisive, his gun clearing leather in a movement too fast for most eyes to follow, while his voice carried the authority of a man who had never backed down from any fight. "I said let her go. The lady is coming with me, and anyone who objects can discuss it with my friend here." The Colt's barrel gleamed in the dying light, its message unmistakable to anyone who had lived long enough in the frontier to understand the language of violence and survival. But even as the crowd began to disperse under the threat of superior firepower, Seraphine's eyes met Lucien's with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion that spoke of someone who had learned not to trust salvation when it appeared too conveniently. "Who are you?" she whispered through her damaged throat, her voice carrying the musical accent of French Louisiana that had once charmed men to their deaths. "And why would you risk everything to save a woman the whole territory calls cursed?" 3 years earlier, Seraphine Valmont had arrived in Redemption Falls as the young bride of Clarence Valmont, the town's wealthiest merchant and most eligible bachelor, her beauty and exotic accent making her the subject of fascination and envy among the frontier women who had never seen anyone quite like her. The wedding had been the social event of the decade, with guests traveling from Denver and Santa Fe to witness the union of frontier wealth and Creole elegance in a ceremony that promised to elevate the rough mining town's social standing. But the honeymoon period had been brief, ending abruptly when Clarence died in his sleep just 6 months after their wedding, his body showing no signs of violence or illness that could explain his sudden demise. The town doctor had declared it heart failure, but whispers began immediately about the beautiful young widow whose tears seemed too controlled and whose inheritance was too convenient to be entirely innocent. The fact that she had been trained in herbal remedies by her grandmother in New Orleans only added fuel to the suspicions that began to surround her like smoke from a prairie fire. The second death had occurred 8 months later, when banker Thomas Morrison had begun courting the widow with persistent attention that she had repeatedly discouraged. His body was found in his office on a Sunday morning, slumped over his desk with no apparent cause of death, except the same mysterious heart failure that had claimed her husband. The coincidence was too much for the town's growing paranoia. and Seraphine found herself increasingly isolated as former friends crossed the street to avoid her and merchants refused to serve her except when absolutely necessary. The third death had sealed her fate in the eyes of Redemption Falls, when Sheriff Wade Collins had attempted to investigate the suspicious pattern of deaths surrounding the beautiful widow. His body was discovered in the jail cell where he had been working late one evening, the door locked from the inside and no signs of struggle except the expression of terror frozen on his face. The town's fear transformed into hatred as people convinced themselves that only supernatural evil could explain such impossible deaths. The final straw had come when cattle began dying on ranches surrounding the town, their bodies found without wounds or signs of disease. Just the same mysterious failure of life that had claimed the men who had shown interest in the widow. Whether the connection was real or imagined, the town had reached the breaking point where fear demanded action, and Seraphine Valmont had become the target of mob justice that would have ended her life if not for the intervention of a stranger whose motives remained as mysterious as her alleged crimes. Lucien Dubois was everything the frontier respected and feared in equal measure. A man whose reputation had been earned through years of surviving situations that killed lesser men, but whose true nature remained hidden behind eyes that had seen too much death and a face that revealed nothing of his thoughts or feelings. His intervention in Seraphine's near lynching was characteristic of someone who made decisions based on principles that others couldn't understand, acting with decisive violence when necessary, but never explaining his motivations to anyone who didn't need to know. The ranch he had built in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains was as isolated and defensible as a man could make it, positioned where he could see anyone approaching from miles away while maintaining access to water, grazing land, and the kind of natural barriers that discouraged unwanted visitors. His reputation for preferring solitude was matched only by stories about what happened to people who violated that preference without invitation, creating a buffer zone of respect and fear that kept his privacy intact. But there were aspects of Lucien's past that even his reputation couldn't capture. Secrets that explained his willingness to rescue a woman accused of supernatural crimes, and his understanding of what it meant to be judged by people who didn't know the truth about circumstances they couldn't comprehend. His own experience with false accusations and mob justice had taught him that innocence and guilt were often determined by fear rather than evidence, and that sometimes salvation required intervention by someone who had nothing left to lose. The decision to take Seraphine to his ranch was practical as well as compassionate, because returning her to any town in the territory would eventually result in the same mob justice they had just escaped. His offer of sanctuary came with conditions that he made clear as they rode through the gathering darkness toward his mountain stronghold. She would work for her keep, she would answer his questions honestly, and she would trust his judgment about her safety even when his methods seemed harsh or incomprehensible. "Why?" Seraphine asked again as they made camp for the night. Her voice, stronger now that the rope burns on her throat had been treated with salve from Lucien's saddlebags. "You don't know me, you don't owe me anything, and helping me makes you an enemy of everyone in Redemption Falls. What could possibly motivate a stranger to take such risks for someone everyone calls cursed?" But Lucien's only response was to bank the fire and settle into his bedroll, leaving her question unanswered as the mountain night closed around them with secrets that might prove more dangerous than any curse. The journey to Lucien's ranch took 3 days through mountain passes that seemed designed to discourage followers, winding trails that required intimate knowledge of the terrain to navigate safely, while providing dozens of opportunities for ambush or accident that would eliminate pursuers without any direct confrontation. Seraphine's riding skills, honed during her privileged childhood in Louisiana, proved adequate for the challenging terrain, but she found herself depending on Lucien's guidance through landscapes that could kill the unprepared with casual indifference. Each night around their carefully concealed campfires, Seraphine attempted to learn more about the man who had saved her life, but Lucien proved as difficult to read as the mountain weather that could change from pleasant to deadly without warning. His questions about her past were precise and thorough, probing the details of her marriages and the deaths that had destroyed her reputation. But his own history remained locked behind walls of silence that seemed impenetrable to normal conversation. The first glimpse of his ranch appeared on the morning of the fourth day, a complex of buildings that seemed to grow naturally from the mountain landscape while providing clear fields of fire in all directions and natural barriers that would make siege warfare the only viable military option for any attacking force. The main house was larger and more comfortable than the isolated location suggested, built with attention to detail that spoke of significant resources and long-term planning rather than the temporary structures that characterized most frontier settlements. But the most revealing aspect of Lucien's domain was the evidence of previous inhabitants, abandoned homesteads scattered throughout the valley, their empty windows and collapsed roofs telling stories of families who had tried to make lives in the mountains but had been defeated by isolation, weather, or threats that Seraphine could only imagine. The graveyard on the hill above the main house contained markers that bore dates spanning decades, suggesting that Lucien's ranch had been built on the bones of failed dreams and broken hopes. "Welcome to Sanctuary Valley," Lucien said as they approached the main house, his voice carrying undertones of irony and sadness that suggested the name meant more than simple geographical description. "You'll be safe here as long as you follow the rules and don't ask questions that I'm not ready to answer. The work is hard, the winters are harsh, and the isolation can drive some people mad, but it's better than hanging from a tree in Redemption Falls." As if to emphasize his point, a cold wind swept down from the peaks above them, carrying the promise of early snow and the kind of loneliness that could break hearts as easily as spirits. Lucien's ranch operated according to principles that reflected both military discipline and frontier pragmatism, with rules that seemed harsh, but proved necessary for survival in an environment where mistakes could be fatal and carelessness could endanger everyone who shared the isolated valley. Seraphine's first week was spent learning routines that would govern her daily existence: when to rise, how to secure the perimeter, which weapons to carry and how to use them, and most importantly, when to ask questions and when to simply follow orders without explanation. The work was indeed hard, involving everything from tending livestock and maintaining equipment to standing watch during the long mountain nights when threats could approach unseen through terrain that provided perfect cover for hostile forces. But Seraphine's aristocratic upbringing had included practical education alongside social graces, and her years of frontier survival had taught her skills that proved valuable in maintaining the complex operation that kept the ranch functioning despite its isolation. The other inhabitants of Sanctuary Valley proved to be as mysterious as Lucien himself, a handful of men and women whose pasts were clearly complicated and whose loyalty to their enigmatic leader was absolute and unquestioned. They treated Seraphine with polite distance that suggested acceptance without friendship, watching her with eyes that evaluated her potential value and threat level while offering help with tasks that required cooperation but avoiding personal conversation that might reveal too much about themselves or their circumstances. But the most disturbing aspect of life at the ranch was the evidence of preparation for siege warfare that went far beyond normal frontier defense measures, including hidden weapons caches, underground tunnels, and communication systems that suggested Lucien was expecting attacks by forces much more dangerous than typical outlaws or hostile natives. The scale of the defensive preparations implied threats that went beyond local law enforcement or criminal elements, suggesting enemies with resources and motivation that made Seraphine's problems with a single town seem almost trivial by comparison. The revelation of what those preparations meant came at the end of her first week, when riders appeared on the distant ridges surrounding the valley, and Lucien's response transformed him from mysterious rancher to military commander in the space of heartbeats. "Get to the main house," he ordered Seraphine, his voice carrying authority that brooked no argument. "Take the rifle from the kitchen cabinet and watch the south windows. If anyone you don't recognize tries to approach the building, shoot them. We've been found. And the war is about to begin." The casual way he spoke of war suggested that violence was not an unexpected development, but rather an inevitable conclusion to circumstances that had been building toward this moment since long before Seraphine's arrival in Sanctuary Valley. The riders who had found Sanctuary Valley wore the badges of federal marshals, but their behavior suggested a mission that went beyond normal law enforcement, as they established positions that clearly indicated preparation for siege warfare rather than simple arrest procedures. Lucien's reaction to their presence was immediate and decisive, transforming the ranch from peaceful sanctuary to armed fortress in minutes, while his people moved with the precision of a military unit that had drilled for exactly this scenario. "Who are they?" Seraphine asked as she took her assigned position at the south window, the rifle unfamiliar but manageable in her hands, while her eyes scanned the landscape for movement that might indicate approaching danger. "Why are federal marshals treating your ranch like an enemy stronghold instead of simply riding up to the front door and stating their business like normal lawmen would do?" Lucien's explanation came in fragments between his preparations for defense, revealing pieces of a story that made his willingness to rescue a cursed widow seem like the natural action of someone who understood persecution by authorities who had decided that truth was less important than convenience. "5 years ago, I was a federal marshal myself," he said, while checking weapons and ammunition supplies. "I uncovered evidence of corruption that went all the way to territorial government, involving land fraud and murder on a scale that would have destroyed careers and reputations if it had been properly investigated." The corruption Lucien had discovered involved a conspiracy between federal officials and private interests to steal land from homesteaders and small ranchers through fraudulent legal processes, using violence and intimidation to drive off families whose property contained valuable mineral deposits or strategic water rights. His attempts to bring the evidence to his superiors had resulted in threats against his life and eventually a frame-up that made him a wanted man rather than a hero of justice, forcing him to choose between submission to corrupt authority and life as an outlaw in the wilderness. "They can't let me live," Lucien continued as the sound of approaching horses grew louder, "because I know too much about too many powerful people who have too much to lose if the truth ever comes out. And now they can't let you live either because you've seen their faces and you know where to find me. We're both dead if they take us alive, which means our only choice is to fight our way out of this valley or die trying." The grim certainty in his voice made it clear that the peaceful sanctuary she had found was about to become a battlefield where survival would depend on courage, skill, and the kind of luck that had already abandoned both of them once before. The first shots shattered the mountain morning like thunder, muzzle flashes winking from the ridges as the federal marshals opened fire on the ranch buildings with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested military training and battlefield experience. Lucien's defensive preparations proved their worth immediately, as concealed positions and reinforced structures absorbed the initial assault, while his people returned fire with accuracy that forced the attackers to seek better cover. Seraphine's aristocratic education had not included training for gun battles, but her survival instincts and Lucien's hastily given instructions combined to make her an effective defender of her assigned position. The rifle kicked against her shoulder with each shot. But her targets were clear against the mountain backdrop, and her motivation was absolute. These men had come to kill her along with everyone else who had offered her sanctuary, making this fight a matter of personal survival rather than abstract justice. The siege tactics employed by the marshals revealed both their resources and their desperation, as they used dynamite to destroy outbuildings and create breaches in the ranch's defenses while maintaining constant pressure that prevented Lucien's people from organizing counterattacks. The explosions sent livestock fleeing in panic, while debris rained down on defenders who were already outnumbered and outgunned by enemies who had clearly planned this assault with careful attention to overwhelming any possible resistance. But Lucien's years of preparation for exactly this scenario had included contingencies that the marshals hadn't anticipated, including escape routes and supply caches that allowed his people to continue fighting even after their primary defensive positions had been compromised. The underground tunnels that connected the main buildings proved invaluable for moving personnel and ammunition while avoiding the sniper fire that made surface movement nearly impossible during daylight hours. As night fell over the burning ranch, Seraphine found herself crouched beside Lucien in a root cellar that served as their command post, listening to reports from his defenders while helping to plan the desperate breakout attempt that represented their only hope for survival. "The horses are ready in the north pasture," reported Miguel Santos. Lucien's segundo, whose weathered face was grim with the knowledge that most of them would not survive the next few hours. "But they've got the valley surrounded, and running means crossing open ground under fire from positions we can't even see." The choice between certain death by siege and probable death by desperate escape was no choice at all, but it was the only option left to people who had already committed themselves to fighting rather than surrendering to corrupt authority. The breakout began at midnight, when mountain darkness was absolute, and the marshals' night vision was compromised by the fires they had started to illuminate potential escape routes, creating the kind of confused battlefield where desperate courage might overcome superior numbers and position. Lucien's plan was audacious in its simplicity: simultaneous attacks on 3 different positions to divide the marshals' attention, while the main group attempted to reach the horses through terrain that offered minimal cover but maximum speed. Seraphine found herself mounted on a horse that seemed to understand the urgency of their situation, following Lucien through darkness so complete that she could barely see his silhouette ahead of her while gunfire erupted throughout the valley like a premature 4th of July celebration. The sound of bullets whining past her head was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, making her feel more alive than she had since her husband's death, while simultaneously reminding her how close she was to joining him in whatever came after life. The pursuit that followed their escape from the valley was relentless and professional, with the marshals using tracking skills and territorial knowledge that made it clear they had prepared for the possibility that Lucien might successfully break their siege. Fresh horses and supply caches allowed them to maintain pressure on the fleeing defenders, while telegraph messages coordinated additional forces to cut off escape routes and establish new ambush positions throughout the mountain territories. But Lucien's knowledge of the wilderness was encyclopedic, gained through years of scouting and survival that had taught him every hidden trail and secret water source in hundreds of square miles of some of the most rugged terrain in North America. His ability to find paths where none seemed to exist and to anticipate the tactical decisions of their pursuers kept the small group of survivors ahead of capture while leading them toward objectives that he had never revealed to anyone else. The revelation of their destination came as they crested a ridge at dawn and saw spread below them a hidden valley that contained structures and equipment that clearly belonged to a much larger operation than anyone had suspected Lucien was capable of organizing. "Welcome to the real sanctuary," he said with grim satisfaction as they rode toward buildings that had been constructed with the kind of resources that suggested backing by powerful allies. The ranch was just a decoy to keep them occupied while the real work was being done here. We've lost the battle, but the war is just beginning. And now they've given us the perfect excuse to take the fight to them instead of waiting for them to come to us. The hidden valley contained evidence of a resistance movement that had been operating for years against the corrupt officials who had destroyed Lucien's career and countless innocent lives, with resources and personnel that suggested backing by legitimate authority figures who had been working to expose the conspiracy from within the system. The buildings housed printing presses, communication equipment, and document storage that indicated careful investigation and evidence gathering on a scale that went far beyond what any single individual could have accomplished alone. Seraphine's introduction to the other members of the resistance revealed that Lucien's reputation as a solitary outlaw was carefully cultivated misdirection designed to protect a network of federal agents, territorial officials, and private citizens who had been working together to gather evidence against the corruption that had infected multiple levels of government. Her rescue from the lynch mob had not been random charity, but rather a calculated move to protect someone whose testimony could provide crucial evidence about deaths that were connected to the land fraud conspiracy. "Your husband discovered the mineral surveys," explained Sarah Mackenzie, a federal prosecutor whose supposed death in a stagecoach accident had been staged to allow her to work undercover within the resistance movement. His bank was being used to launder money from illegal land sales, and when he threatened to expose the operation, they arranged his death to look like natural causes. The other men who died were also getting too close to the truth about what was happening in Redemption Falls. The revelation that Clarence Valmont had been murdered for his integrity rather than dying of natural causes transformed Seraphine's understanding of everything that had happened to her, explaining the mysterious deaths that had made her a pariah while revealing that her reputation as a cursed widow had been deliberately created to discredit her potential testimony. The men who had died around her had all been investigating different aspects of the same conspiracy, making their deaths appear supernatural rather than systematic assassination by enemies who understood the power of fear and superstition in frontier communities. But the most shocking revelation was that the lynch mob in Redemption Falls had been organized and funded by the same corrupt officials who had arranged her husband's murder, using mob justice to eliminate a witness while maintaining plausible deniability about her death. "They've been planning to kill you for 3 years, Lucien explained as Seraphine processed the implications of what she was learning. But they needed it to look like frontier justice rather than assassination, which meant waiting for the right moment when public opinion was sufficiently poisoned against you to make your death seem inevitable rather than convenient." The scope of the resistance movement was staggering in its complexity and reach, involving coordinated efforts by honest officials throughout the territorial government, who had been working for years to gather evidence against a conspiracy that involved tens of millions of dollars in fraudulent land deals and hundreds of deaths designed to silence witnesses or eliminate inconvenient property owners. The Hidden Valley served as headquarters for operations that extended from Colorado to California, coordinating intelligence gathering and evidence preservation that would eventually bring down the entire criminal network. Seraphine's role in the conspiracy had been larger than she realized because her husband's bank records contained evidence of money laundering operations that connected corrupt federal officials with private mining interests and territorial politicians in ways that could destroy careers and result in prison sentences for dozens of powerful men. Her survival and potential testimony represented a threat to criminal operations worth millions of dollars annually, making her elimination a high priority for enemies who had already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to protect their interests. The Resistance's investigation had revealed that the deaths in Redemption Falls were part of a larger pattern of systematic assassination that had been disguised as accidents, natural deaths, and random violence throughout the territories where the land fraud operation was most active. The conspiracy involved federal marshals, territorial judges, mining company executives, and banking officials who had created a network of corruption that perverted every aspect of law enforcement and legal authority in pursuit of illegal profits. But the evidence-gathering phase of the Resistance's work was nearly complete, and the time was approaching when they would have enough proof to present a case that could not be ignored or suppressed by the corrupt officials who had been protecting the conspiracy from exposure. The attack on Lucien's ranch represented desperation by enemies who knew their criminal empire was about to be exposed, making them willing to risk open warfare rather than allow the evidence of their crimes to reach honest authorities. "Tomorrow we leave for Denver," Lucien announced, as the resistance leaders planned their final offensive against the conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives. We have appointments with federal judges and territorial officials who are still honest, and we have enough evidence to hang dozens of men who thought they were above the law. But the trip will be dangerous because our enemies know we're coming and they'll try everything to stop us from reaching our destination. The promise of justice was finally within reach, but claiming it would require surviving one last desperate attempt by corrupt officials to protect their criminal empire through violence and intimidation. The trip to Denver required careful planning and elaborate precautions, because the evidence they carried could destroy the careers and lives of powerful men who had the resources to organize assassination attempts using both criminal elements and corrupt law enforcement officials. The resistance divided into multiple groups traveling different routes, with decoy caravans designed to draw attention away from the real evidence carriers, while armed escorts provided protection against the attacks that everyone knew were inevitable. Seraphine found herself traveling with Lucien and a small group of his most trusted people, carrying copies of the most crucial documents, while the originals were transported by other teams using routes that had been planned to minimize the risk of total loss if any single group was captured or killed. The responsibility of protecting evidence that could bring justice for her husband's murder and dozens of other crimes made every mile of the journey feel like a personal mission rather than simply another dangerous ride through hostile territory. The first attack came at dawn on the second day, when riders emerged from concealed positions along the trail with weapons already drawn and clear intentions to kill everyone in the caravan rather than simply recover the evidence they carried. The battle was brief but savage, with desperate determination on both sides as the resistance fighters protected documents that represented years of investigation while their attackers fought to preserve a criminal empire worth millions of dollars. Lucien's combat skills proved devastating in the close-quarters fighting that followed the initial ambush, his guns creating a zone of death around the wagon that carried Seraphine and the evidence, while his tactical leadership coordinated the defense that eventually drove off the surviving attackers. But the cost of victory was high, with 2 resistance members killed and several others wounded badly enough to require medical attention that would delay their arrival in Denver by precious days. The aftermath of the attack revealed that their enemies had detailed knowledge of their travel plans and routes, suggesting that the conspiracy included informants within the resistance movement who were feeding information to corrupt officials. "We can't trust anyone except ourselves now," Lucien said grimly, as they buried their dead and prepared to continue toward Denver using trails that he hoped were still secret. "They know we're coming. They know what we're carrying, and they'll keep trying to stop us until we're all dead or the evidence is in the hands of honest authorities. From here on, we assume that everyone except our immediate group is potentially an enemy." The paranoia was justified, but it also meant that the final leg of their journey would be accomplished without allies or safe havens in a territory where corruption had infected every level of authority. The discovery that Sarah Mackenzie had been feeding information to their enemies came when Lucien noticed discrepancies between the intelligence she had provided about safe routes and the locations where attacks had been planned, patterns that suggested someone with detailed knowledge of their plans was coordinating with the corrupt officials who wanted to prevent the evidence from reaching Denver. The confrontation with the woman they had trusted was painful but necessary, revealing that even the resistance movement had been infiltrated by enemies who understood the value of information and the power of betrayal. Sarah's confession came only after Lucien presented irrefutable evidence of her treachery, admitting that she had been blackmailed into cooperation by threats against her children who were being held hostage by the same criminal network she had supposedly been fighting. "They have my daughter and son," she sobbed, her career as a federal prosecutor making her acutely aware of what would happen to her family if she refused to cooperate with demands that had escalated from simple information sharing to active sabotage of resistance operations. The revelation that the conspiracy was using hostages to control potential opponents added another layer of complexity to the moral calculations that had driven the resistance movement, forcing honest officials to choose between justice and the lives of their loved ones, while providing the criminal network with powerful leverage against anyone who might threaten their operations. The systematic use of family members as bargaining chips explained how the conspiracy had been able to maintain its secrecy despite involving hundreds of people across multiple territories. But Sarah's betrayal also provided valuable intelligence about the conspiracy's current operations and leadership, revealing that the criminal network was more desperate and disorganized than they had appeared. With internal conflicts and resource limitations that could be exploited by resistance fighters who understood how to use the enemy's weaknesses against them. The decision to rescue Sarah's children rather than simply executing her for treason was both compassionate and strategic, offering the possibility of turning a compromised asset back into a valuable ally. "We're going to get your children back," Lucien promised as they planned a rescue mission that would require splitting their already small force while racing against time to reach Denver before their enemies could organize additional attacks. "But first, we need to know everything about their security arrangements and backup plans. Because saving your family won't mean anything if we fail to deliver this evidence to honest authorities." The rescue mission would be dangerous and complicated, but it also offered the opportunity to strike a blow against their enemies while demonstrating that the resistance movement was strong enough to protect its own people even while pursuing larger objectives. The criminal network's headquarters was located in an abandoned mining complex outside Colorado Springs, chosen for its isolation and defensibility while providing the kind of legitimate business cover that made surveillance by law enforcement unlikely. The facility served as both operational center and prison for the hostages who were being used to control resistance members and potential witnesses, making it a high-value target that could serve multiple purposes if the rescue mission was successful. Seraphine's participation in the assault was controversial within the resistance group, but her determination to help rescue Sarah's children combined with her proven courage under fire made her inclusion inevitable, despite the additional risks involved in protecting someone who was not trained for military operations. Her knowledge of the conspiracy's methods and her personal stake in seeing justice done also made her valuable as someone who could identify documents and personnel that might be crucial to completing their mission. The attack began at midnight when guards were most likely to be tired and inattentive. Using diversionary explosions to draw defenders away from the main complex, while the rescue team infiltrated through drainage tunnels that Lucien had located during his scouting mission. The underground approach was claustrophobic and dangerous, but it allowed them to reach the prison area without triggering the alarm systems that would have brought overwhelming force against any surface assault. The rescue of Sarah's children was accomplished with minimal violence, but the intelligence they gathered while searching the complex revealed that the criminal conspiracy was planning a final desperate gambit to prevent the evidence from reaching federal authorities in Denver. "They're going to attack the federal courthouse," explained Marcus Thompson, the resistance member whose expertise in military tactics had made the rescue mission possible. "They'd rather start a shooting war in downtown Denver than allow honest judges to review the evidence that will destroy their entire operation." The implication that innocent civilians would be caught in the crossfire of a battle between corrupt officials and federal authorities added urgency to their mission while revealing the true desperation of enemies who were willing to risk everything to prevent their crimes from being exposed. "We have to get there first," Lucien said as they prepared to leave the mining complex with rescued hostages and captured intelligence. "If they attack the courthouse before we can present our evidence, they'll claim that we were the criminals and that their violence was justified law enforcement. The truth won't matter if they control the narrative about what happened." The final ride to Denver was a desperate race against enemies who had superior numbers and resources, but lacked the moral certainty that drove the resistance fighters forward despite exhaustion and mounting casualties from continuous attacks along the trail. Every mile brought them closer to safety and justice, but it also brought them closer to the final confrontation that would determine whether years of investigation and sacrifice would result in triumph or tragedy for everyone involved. Seraphine's transformation from pampered aristocrat to hardened frontier fighter was complete by the time they reached the outskirts of Denver, her skills with weapons and survival tactics having been forged in the crucible of violence that had characterized their entire journey from the mountains to the territorial capital. The woman who had once been called cursed now carried herself with the confidence of someone who had faced death repeatedly and emerged victorious through courage and determination. The evidence they carried had been supplemented by intelligence gathered during the rescue mission, creating a comprehensive case against the criminal conspiracy that included financial records, correspondence between corrupt officials, and testimony from witnesses who had been silenced through violence or intimidation. The documentation was extensive enough to support prosecution of dozens of defendants, while exposing the full scope of a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for years. But their arrival in Denver was complicated by the realization that the city was already under the influence of corrupt officials who had been warned of their approach and were prepared to use legal authority and police power to prevent the evidence from reaching honest judges. The streets contained too many federal marshals and territorial agents whose loyalty was questionable, while the courthouse itself was surrounded by men whose presence suggested preparation for the battle that everyone knew was coming. "We need to get inside the federal building before they can organize enough force to stop us," Lucien explained as they observed the tactical situation from concealed positions outside the city center. "Once we're inside with honest federal authorities, the evidence will be protected and the case will be beyond their ability to suppress through violence or intimidation. But reaching safety means fighting our way through enemies who have every advantage except moral authority." The final battle for justice was about to begin in the heart of civilization, where corrupt officials would have to choose between abandoning their criminal empire or openly defying federal authority in ways that would expose their crimes to scrutiny they could not survive. The assault on the federal courthouse began when corrupt marshals attempted to arrest the resistance members before they could enter the building, forcing a gun battle in downtown Denver that shocked civilians and federal officials who had not understood the scope of the conspiracy they were witnessing. Seraphine found herself fighting alongside Lucien in the streets of a major city, their weapons creating zones of deadly fire while they advanced toward the building that represented their only hope for sanctuary and justice. The resistance fighters' tactical advantage lay in their desperation and moral certainty, factors that made them willing to take risks that their enemies couldn't match despite superior numbers and better positions. Lucien's leadership coordinated their advance, while his marksmanship eliminated threats that would have stopped less skilled fighters, but the cost of their progress was measured in blood and bullets that seemed to diminish their chances of reaching safety with each passing minute. But the battle also attracted attention from honest federal officials, who had been unaware of the corruption within their own ranks, bringing reinforcements that shifted the tactical balance in favor of the resistance fighters while exposing the criminal conspiracy to scrutiny by authorities who could not be intimidated or corrupted. The arrival of federal troops, who had been ordered to restore order without regard to which side claimed legal authority, transformed the street battle into a rout of corrupt officials who could not justify their actions to superior officers. The presentation of evidence to federal judge Harrison Montgomery was anticlimactic after the violence that had preceded it, but the documentation they carried was comprehensive enough to support immediate arrest warrants for dozens of defendants while providing the foundation for prosecutions that would continue for years. The judge's reaction to the scope of the conspiracy was shock, followed by determination to see justice done regardless of the political consequences for territorial government and federal authority. This evidence documents criminal conspiracy involving federal officials, territorial judges, and private interests on a scale that threatens the fundamental integrity of law and government in the Western Territories, Judge Montgomery declared after reviewing the documents they had risked everything to deliver. Arrest warrants will be issued immediately, and I'm requesting federal military assistance to ensure that these criminals cannot escape justice through violence or political influence. The words they had fought so desperately to hear finally provided the vindication that had cost so many lives and required such enormous sacrifices from people who had believed that truth and justice were worth defending regardless of the personal cost. The federal response to Judge Montgomery's evidence was swift and comprehensive, with arrest warrants being executed simultaneously across multiple territories to prevent the conspiracy's leadership from escaping or coordinating resistance to the legal authority that was finally being brought to bear against their criminal empire. The military assistance that had been requested ensured that corrupt local officials could not interfere with federal law enforcement, while the scope of the evidence made it impossible for political influence to protect the defendants from prosecution. Seraphine's testimony about her husband's murder and the systematic intimidation that had followed provided crucial evidence for prosecution of the officials who had ordered his death while creating the supernatural reputation that had made her a pariah in Redemption Falls. Her detailed knowledge of the banking records that had triggered the conspiracy against her family proved invaluable in connecting financial crimes to the violence that had been used to protect them from exposure. The collapse of the criminal network had immediate effects throughout the territories where corruption had perverted law enforcement and government authority, with honest officials finally able to pursue justice without fear of retaliation, while communities that had been terrorized by systematic violence began to understand that their suffering had been orchestrated by criminals rather than caused by random frontier lawlessness. But the victory came with personal costs that could not be erased by legal vindication, as the years of violence and fear had taken tolls that would require time and healing to overcome. Seraphine's reputation as a cursed widow would eventually be replaced by recognition of her courage and integrity, but the process of rebuilding trust and community connections would require patience and forgiveness from people who had been manipulated into believing lies about her character. The most significant personal revelation came when Lucien admitted that his rescue of Seraphine had been motivated by more than justice or compassion. His feelings for her having developed during their shared trials in ways that he had not allowed himself to acknowledge while their survival remained in doubt. "I love you," he said simply as they stood together in the federal courthouse, where their long journey had finally reached its destination. "I've loved you since the moment I saw you facing that mob with courage that should have belonged to someone twice your size and half your sense. Will you marry me and help me build something good from the ashes of all this destruction?" Seraphine's response to Lucien's proposal was complicated by emotions that had been suppressed during months of danger and uncertainty, her heart finally free to acknowledge feelings that had been growing despite her determination to focus on survival and justice rather than personal happiness. The man who had saved her life had also restored her faith in human decency and the possibility that love could exist without the corruption and violence that had destroyed her previous marriage. "Yes," she said with tears that combined joy and relief in equal measure. "But I need to know that you're proposing to me, and not to the idea of saving someone who was called cursed. I've been rescued by a hero, but I want to be loved by a man who sees me as a partner rather than a victim who needs protection." Her response revealed both vulnerability and strength, acknowledging her gratitude while asserting her need for equality in any relationship that would define her future. Lucien's answer demonstrated the depth of his understanding and respect for the woman she had become through their shared trials, as he took her hands and spoke with the honesty that had characterized their partnership throughout their fight for justice. "I'm not proposing to rescue you," he said gently. "I'm proposing because you've proven to be the strongest, bravest, most intelligent woman I've ever known. and I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your partnership. You don't need saving. You need someone who appreciates what you've accomplished and wants to help you build whatever comes next." The wedding that followed was small and private, attended only by the resistance members who had survived their long campaign and the federal officials who had helped them achieve justice despite the obstacles placed in their path by corrupt authorities. The ceremony took place in the same courthouse where they had delivered the evidence that had vindicated their sacrifices, making their marriage both personal celebration and symbolic victory over the forces that had tried to destroy them. But even as they exchanged vows and promised to build a future together, both Seraphine and Lucien understood that their work was not finished. Because the corruption they had exposed was symptomatic of larger problems that would require continued vigilance and courage to address. Their marriage was not an ending, but a beginning, marking their commitment to each other and to the principles that had brought them together in pursuit of justice and truth. The ranch that Lucien and Seraphine built together was located in a valley that had been purchased with reward money from the prosecution of the criminal conspiracy, chosen for its beauty and defensibility while providing the kind of isolation that allowed them to create a life free from the associations that had marked their previous experiences with violence and corruption. The property was large enough to support a sustainable operation while providing employment for other resistance members who had chosen to remain together rather than dispersing to separate lives. Seraphine's reputation as a cursed widow was gradually replaced by recognition of her courage and integrity as the truth about the conspiracy became public knowledge throughout the territories. But the process of rebuilding trust and community connections required patience and forgiveness from people who had been manipulated into believing lies about her character. Her willingness to testify against the men who had murdered her husband and terrorized her community had made her a hero to many people, but it had also made her a target for those who remained loyal to the corrupt officials who had been exposed. The first year of their marriage was spent establishing the ranch and adjusting to life without the constant threat of violence that had characterized their courtship. But both of them struggled with the transition from war to peace, while learning to trust that their happiness would not be destroyed by enemies who had been eliminated or imprisoned. The skills they had developed during their fight for justice proved valuable in building a successful ranch operation. But they had to learn new ways of relating to each other when survival was no longer the primary consideration. Lucien's work as a federal consultant on corruption investigations kept him traveling throughout the territories where his expertise was needed to identify and eliminate criminal networks that remained from the conspiracy they had destroyed. While Seraphine managed the ranch and developed business relationships that helped them build financial security for their future. Their partnership was strengthened by shared values and mutual respect, but it was also tested by the practical challenges of creating a normal life after experiencing extraordinary circumstances together. The most significant challenge came when Seraphine discovered she was pregnant, a development that forced them to confront their fears about bringing children into a world where their past actions had made them permanent targets for anyone seeking revenge against the people who had destroyed the criminal empire that had enriched so many corrupt officials. The decision to have children required faith that justice and love were stronger than hatred and vengeance, a belief that had sustained them through their darkest hours, but now needed to guide them toward an uncertain but hopeful future. The birth of their daughter, Marie-Claire Dubois, marked a transformation in both parents, as they discovered that their love for each other had created something even more precious than their own happiness. A new life that represented hope for a future where courage and integrity would triumph over corruption and violence. The child's arrival also forced them to confront the reality that their past would always be part of their family's history, but that how they chose to remember and honor that past would determine what lessons they passed on to the next generation. Seraphine's maternal instincts were as strong as her survival instincts had been during their fight for justice, but she was determined that her daughter would grow up knowing her own strength, rather than depending on others for protection or validation. The skills she had learned during months of violence and danger were adapted to teach Marie Claire how to think for herself, defend herself, and stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost involved. Lucien's transformation from legendary gunfighter to devoted father was equally complete, as he channeled his protective instincts and tactical knowledge into creating a secure environment where his daughter could grow up without the constant threat of violence that had marked his own life. His reputation continued to provide deterrent value against potential threats, but his focus shifted from hunting criminals to building a legacy that would honor the people who had died in pursuit of justice. The ranch became a gathering place for other families who had been affected by the corruption conspiracy, creating a community of people who understood the value of justice and the price that had been paid to achieve it. The children who grew up together in the valley would inherit both the memory of their parents' courage and the responsibility to continue defending the principles that had cost so much to establish. But the most important legacy was the love story that had emerged from circumstances that should have destroyed any possibility of happiness, proving that even the darkest situations could produce relationships that transcended the violence and hatred that had threatened to consume everyone involved. Their marriage became an example for other couples who had been tested by extraordinary circumstances, demonstrating that true partnership could survive anything when both people were committed to supporting each other regardless of external pressures. 20 years after the lynch rope had been placed around her neck in Redemption Falls, Seraphine Dubois stood on the porch of her ranch house, watching her daughter ride toward home from college in Denver. Her heart filled with pride for the young woman who had inherited her mother's courage and her father's sense of justice while choosing to pursue a career in law that would continue the family's commitment to fighting corruption and protecting the innocent. The valley that had once served as headquarters for a resistance movement had evolved into a thriving community that included families, businesses, and institutions that reflected the values for which so many people had fought and died during the conspiracy years. The school that Lucien had built taught children about civic responsibility and moral courage alongside traditional academic subjects, while the church that Seraphine had helped design served a congregation that included people from diverse backgrounds, united by shared commitment to justice and community service. Lucien's work as a federal investigator had evolved into consultation and training for law enforcement agencies throughout the Western Territories, his expertise in identifying and combating corruption helping to prevent the kind of systematic criminal conspiracy that had once threatened to destroy legitimate government authority. His reputation as someone who could not be bought or intimidated had made him valuable to honest officials while maintaining his effectiveness as a deterrent to criminal elements who might consider targeting his family or community. The transformation of Seraphine's reputation from cursed widow to respected community leader was complete. But more importantly, she had found peace with her own identity as someone who had survived extraordinary trials without being broken by them. Her marriage to Lucien had provided the foundation for a life that honored her first husband's memory while building something new and beautiful from the ashes of tragedy and loss. As the sun set over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of the dawn when a mysterious rancher had saved her from mob justice, Seraphine reflected on the journey that had brought her from despair to happiness through courage, love, and the unwavering belief that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. The widow everyone had called cursed had found her greatest blessing in the arms of a man who had seen her strength instead of her supposed sins, proving that sometimes salvation came in the most unexpected forms and that true love could indeed conquer every obstacle when two hearts were united in pursuit of justice and truth.